In this lecture, we're going to queue our styles. WordPress has a queue for a list of files that should be loaded on the site. If we add our files to this queue, they will get loaded, thus fixing our site. There are two steps for queuing a file. First, we need to register the file. After registering the file, we can add it to the queue. Let's get started. We'll be working inside the enqueue.php file. Two types of files can be registered. They're CSS and JavaScript files. For this lecture, we're going to focus on CSS. As I mentioned earlier, we need to register a file. Registering a file means we're telling WordPress the existence of a file. We can tell WordPress where to find the file along with other details. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to a function called WP Register Style. The WP Register Style function can help us register a CSS file. If we scroll down, we will come across a list of parameters. Most functions will have a parameters section, which describes the values that can be passed into the function. Out of all the sections, this section is probably the most important for a function. Previously, we skimmed over this section. Let's dive deeper into the details. A lot is going on. To begin with, WordPress will document the name of the parameter. This is followed by the data type of a parameter. As we learned, variables are assigned data types by the language. It's not something we need to handle. However, that doesn't mean we can pass on any type of value. WordPress recommends specific data types for its parameters. In some cases, parameters can have multiple data types. For example, the source parameter can be a string or a boolean. Below this parameter, the dependencies parameter can accept an array of strings. Arrays are annotated with a pair of square brackets. Whenever you see square brackets, the function parameter's value can be an array. After the data type, WordPress will tell you if a value is required. In this example, the first two are required. The last three are optional. Generally, WordPress will provide default values for optional parameters. Lastly, a description is given for each parameter. Feel free to read these descriptions. We will be reviewing them shortly. I always consider it good practice to check out a function's documentation page for a list of parameters. They're going to help you understand a function's behavior. Let's try using this function for registering a CSS file. In our editors, open the static index template file. To get started, let's get an overview of the CSS styles linked in the document. In the index template file, we have a couple of CSS files in the head section of the document. We're going to start from the top and work our way down. The first style sheet is for a Google font. Let's copy the path from the href attributes. Everything else can be ignored. Switch over to the enqueue file. We're going to call the WP Register Style function. The first parameter is the handle name. The handle name can be thought of as a unique ID for reference. We're going to set the first parameter to uFont Rubik Pacifico. Just like functions, it's common practice to prefix our handle names. We're going to prefix our asset files with the letter U, which is short for Udemy. Let's move on to the second parameter. The second parameter is the URL to the file. Keep in mind, the URL must be a valid HTTP URL. We cannot pass in a system path. Luckily, our Google font is served from a CDN. The URL is completely valid. Let's paste in the URL we copied earlier. We've successfully registered our first style. Let's try loading the other style sheets. Back in the static template, we have two files left. They're called Bootstrap Icons and Index. Let's try loading the icon set. Copy the full path. Back in the enqueue.php file, run the WP Register Style function. The WP Register Style function must be called for each style sheet. Unfortunately, we can't provide a full array of files to be registered. For the first argument, let's set the ID to uBootstrapIcons. Next, let's pass in the path to the file. There's just one problem. It's not a valid HTTP URL. We must generate a fully valid HTTP URL to this file. Hard-coding the URL is not an option. It's the same reason as before. WordPress installations can vary from one another. One path may work for one installation but not for another. Luckily, WordPress can help us with this problem. Let's wrap the string with a function called getThemeFileURI. This function will return a URL to our theme. It makes our lives so much easier. We don't have to check for an SSL certificate or if the WordPress directories have changed. This function will always return the correct URL to our theme. We don't need to do anything to make sure this function is available to us. It's defined by WordPress. This function has one argument, which is a path relative to the file in our theme. Keep in mind, the asset files are stored inside the assets directory. Let's add the assets directory at the beginning of the path. One thing worth mentioning is how similar the name of the function is to the getThemeFile path. To be clear, they're different functions. The URI function will return a HTTP URL, whereas the path function will return the full system path to the theme. Both functions generate paths to a file. With that being said, we're finished. We've covered the two scenarios you'll come across when loading files. In some cases, you may have a fully valid HTTP URL to a file. If that's the case, you can paste the URL as the second argument. If a file lives locally in your theme, you will need to generate an HTTP URL. The getThemeFileURI function can help you with this task. There are other parameters, but we don't need to provide values for them. Let's register the last CSS file. The process will be similar. As an exercise, try this on your own. If we switch over to the index template, the other CSS file is called index.css. Register this file with WordPress. It'll be the same process as before. Pause the video and good luck. Welcome back. Hopefully, you were able to register the other CSS file. If not, that's fine. Let's walk through the solution together. First things first, let's copy the path from the link tag. Switch over to the enqueue.php file. We're going to call the WP register style function again. Set the handle name to uTheme. Lastly, let's call the getThemeFileURI function with the path. We're finished. The first two parameters of the WP register style function are required. The next three are optional. We're not going to be using them, but let's talk about them. The third parameter is an array of dependencies. In some cases, our CSS may need other CSS files to work properly. For example, let's say our theme CSS file needs the icon file. The icon file can be considered a dependency. In that case, we can pass an array to the third parameter. In this array, we need to add a list of handle names. We'll pass in uBootstrapIcons. If the theme file gets enqueued, the Bootstrap Icons file will get enqueued too. WordPress will take care of loading a file's dependencies before loading the file. If a dependency can't be found, WordPress will not load the file. We're not going to need dependencies. Let's remove this array. We've completed the first step. We can move on to the next step. Let's begin queuing the files in the following lecture.